Jonathan Sumption, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us. It's hugely appreciated. I want to get into the article that you have written for us, this week's cover story, in a second. But I thought I'd give readers a sense of how sort of seriously we've taken this subject. And you and I have been back and forth on this, speaking by telephone and by emails, trying to ensure that we're treating this story with the seriousness that it deserves. And you have from the beginning. And we both, I think that it is important that we are able to sort of speak freely and clearly, without fear or favor, about something that is probably the most important question today in world affairs. And
yes, I agree with that, all of that.
Good. And I want you to help explain to the listeners how you came to the conclusions that you did, and then perhaps you could explain the conclusions that you actually did reach.
Well, I've always taken the average newspaper reader's interest in Middle Eastern politics and in the issues between Israel and the Palestinians in particular. It's one of the great sources of political instability in the current world. It repays attention from everybody. But I've never previously taken an active part in the debate on any side. That began to change as a result of an invitation that I was given to sign a letter written by various academic and practicing lawyers. Initially, it was about the impact of the judgment of the International Criminal Court on the South African government's application to have it labelled genocide. The evidence wasn't all available at that stage, but it seemed to me that the way that the International Court had framed its judgment and its order suggested that they thought that there was at least a prima facie case of genocide. Now, the meaning of this judgment has been much disputed. That was my view, it still is my view, about what they were saying. They weren't deciding the issue finally. They were saying that there was a sufficiently cogent set of facts to make this an accusation that was worth seriously considering. Mm-hmm. And they made an order that the Israeli government should abstain from doing anything which could be regarded as genocide in future. It seemed to me that was a letter which, having studied the facts quite carefully, I was prepared to sign. Subsequently, another letter was produced by the same group, which dealt with more recent evidence suggesting much more powerfully that there were both war crimes and genocide was happening in Gaza. I took the view that the case that Israel is guilty of war crimes is very strong. The case that it's guilty of genocide is very much more debatable, but plausible. Mm-hmm. I ought to explain what these two kinds of international crime are. War crimes is essentially a breach of the basic international laws governing the conduct of war. Mm-hmm. It's not about whose fault it was. It's not about who started it. Mm-hmm. Israel undoubtedly has a cast-iron right of self-defense, but even those who have a cast-iron right to go to war are required by international law to comply with certain restrictions on the methods that they use. These restrictions are contained in the 4 Geneva Conventions signed in 1949. Israel is a party to those, and in a number of protocols, of which the most important were signed in 1977. Israel is not party to the protocols, but most of what the protocols say is also a matter of customary international law. And this is a substantial and serious body of law which is based on state practice. Customary international law means things that the consensus of states do, specifically on the footing that they are obliged to do it. It's not just a voluntary act. And there is a significant body of law on that subject. The sources for it are military manuals across the world, the occasional decisions of courts, but it's usefully codified by the International Committee of the Red Cross, which has played a really enormously valuable role in enabling people to understand what the laws of war are. And the International Committee of the Red Cross are realists. They're not trying to abolish war. They can see that that's not possible. Equally, they accept that you can't totally humanize war. You can make it a bit less inhuman. Mm-hmm. And their documentation is a very valuable source of customary international law. The main effects of the combined Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law, which is the name that we give to customary international law on the subject of war, the main provisions are basically designed to ensure that civilians are, as far as possible, protected from the use of indiscriminate weaponry that can't be controlled once it's released, or whose impact can't be controlled. It is definitely not permitted to target civilians. It is not permitted to forcibly displace civilians, except occasionally temporarily for their own protection. And there are a number of rules of that sort. There are also specific rules dealing with the kind of targets that are, with very rare exceptions, forbidden. Hospitals, water and power facilities that the civilian population needs in order to survive.
Mm-hmm. Can I go through each of these in turn? I think that would be valuable. The first question I have is about this idea of self-defense. Now, one query that I sort of keep coming back to in my head about this is that applies presumably to states against other states, and becomes more difficult when it's a state defending itself against a non-state actor. Now, in the case of Israel, it is defending itself against a non-state actor that is a government of a non-state in Gaza. And Gaza is a sort of semi-occupied territory or controlled territory. Israel, in effect, controls that land. Now, how does that principle of self-defense apply in such a situation?
There are different kinds of non-state actors. There are straightforward terrorists, to use a convenient shorthand. And there are governments which, for one reason or another, have not been recognized as governing states. Hamas is obviously in the first of those categories. The government of Gaza, which is run by Hamas, is in the second. So the status of Gaza is extremely uncertain. What is clear is that Gaza is a territory which does have a government, mm-hmm. And which does have publicly provided facilities, and its government has responsibilities to its people for their health and well-being and so on. So it's not easy to classify in the traditional classifications of these things. However, the International Criminal Court, under the Rome Statute, has accepted that Palestine, including Gaza, can be treated as a state for the purposes of international crimes within its jurisdiction. That decision was regarded with abhorrence by the Israeli government, but it is a realistic view. I mean, traditionally there are countries which recognize other countries depending on whether they approve of them. The United States has a long tradition of doing that. There are countries like ours which normally recognize foreign entities as states if they are like states, if they could perform the kind of function that one expects of states and of their governments. The latter is a much more realistic view, and in a body of law that is supposed to deal in a practical sense with real problems, it seems to me to be right to regard Gaza and, for that matter, the West Bank as if they were states.
Although the West Bank probably less so than Gaza.
Well, the left bank has its own government, but it is and has for many years been divided into sectors, some of which are effectively part of Israel, although in international law not so.
And on the question of war crimes, was there a point in this war when you felt that your judgment had tipped into the belief that what you were seeing was a war crime? Was there a moment, or is there a sort of series of moments?
No, there wasn't a moment. As the situation got worse in Gaza, one's concerns became more serious, and there came a point when it seemed to me that this was altogether excessive. The basic problem concerns proportionality. One of the most significant rules of international humanitarian law is that you cannot attack facilities simply because there is a military value in doing so. There's got to be more than that. If an attack on a facility which has real military value would involve disproportionate casualties among civilians, then you can't do it. Now, disproportionate casualties among civilians is an elastic concept, and it's a concept that people can disagree about. But, when you are faced with extremes, and I think we are faced with extremes in Gaza, you have a situation in which the Israeli Defense Forces say, we need to take out this, that, or the other building because a floor of it is used by Hamas, or there are tunnels underneath hospitals or schools. And the question therefore arises, is that a legitimate act of war? The answer is, if the collateral consequences for civilians are out of all proportion to the military value of proceeding with the operation, then it is contrary to international humanitarian law to do it.
Okay, and so in your judgment, and I think from what you've said there, and as readers will see when they read your piece, the accusation of war crimes is much clearer than the accusation of genocide. And I think that moves us on to this question of genocide. Now, I think I mistakenly, for a long time, felt that the word genocide meant something different to what it actually meant in legal terms. And I wonder, first of all, about your thoughts on that, because I think for a lot of people, they assume that word means, in effect, a kind of a killing, a mass killing, industrialized killing of an entire group of people. And actually the bar appears to be different in international law.
People think of genocide in terms of the appalling case which first generated the word, namely the Nazi persecution of the Jews in particular and certain other categories. There is a genocide convention of 1951, which almost all countries of the world have signed up to, including Israel. And it defines genocide as the intentional elimination, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, the intentional elimination of all or part of an ethnic or national or religious group. So you do not need to embark upon the total destruction of a relevant group in order to be guilty of genocide. the destruction of part of it will do. Now, it's a question of intent. So the fact that that military operations have a catastrophic impact on a particular, let us say, ethnic or national group isn't enough. It has to be intended that way. And that means that it's always likely to be debatable what the intention was. And there may be parallel intentions, several intentions, of which only one is the elimination of the group. Now, what persuaded me that genocide was a plausible explanation of what was happening in Gaza was the statements of a number of prominent Israeli politicians associated with the government since the outset of Operation Gideon's Chariots, which began on the 16th of May of this year. These statements come from cabinet ministers, and in one case Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and suggest that the object of current operations, or a significant object at any rate, is to remove the population of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and distribute them to third countries. Now, removing a population against their will to another country permanently, quite apart from the difficulty that it requires the consent of the other country, but removing them is not itself genocide. It's a war crime. It's contrary to the Geneva Conventions, but it is not in itself genocide. However, if you systematically kill people so as to force them out, it seems to me that the process of killing is capable of being genocide. So currently, the population of the Gaza Strip is about 2 million. The most reliable estimates of casualties are somewhere on the north side of 50,000. The regularity with which Gaza has been pounded by the Air Force, with which, for example, shootings have happened at food distribution centers of people who could not possibly represent a threat to either Israel or Israel's forces on the ground. These things suggest that a part of the population of the Gaza Strip is being killed for the purpose of encouraging the totality of the population to move elsewhere. Now, that is, I think, the only real inference that you can draw from statements made by cabinet ministers like Mr. Smotrich and Mr. Ben-Gvir, who are both long-standing advocates of what we would call ethnic cleansing. And they, as it happens, are the two Israeli politicians who have recently been the object of sanctions imposed by the UK government and 4 other governments. Now, it is said, at least the British government's sanctions statement says, that they are being sanctioned in their personal capacity. The problem about this is that Netanyahu presides over a fragile coalition of different groups. Mr. Ben-Gvir and Mr. Smotrich are at the extreme nationalist and right-wing end of that spectrum. But because the majority, the government's majority in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is small, their departure would bring about the fall of the government. Mr. Smotrich did, in fact, resign earlier this year, but was persuaded to come back. Now, what that means is that the Israeli government can't really dissociate itself from their views because it can't move too far from their policy without losing its majority. And indeed, 2 statements from other prominent politicians are relevant here. One is a statement by Mr. Netanyahu to a Knesset committee, in which he said that houses were being destroyed in Gaza, and it's notable that more than 9/10 of the housing stock of Gaza has been either destroyed or rendered uninhabitable by damage. That a purpose of the attack on housing was to make sure that the Palestinians had nowhere to return to. Another interesting statement, more recent than that, last week, from Katz, who is the current defense minister, was to the effect that it was proposed to build on the ruins of Rafah, one of the border crossing points, a very large camp in which Palestinians could be interned pending their departure for third countries. Now, all of this, when coupled with the scale on which Israel is currently attacking a population which is already on its knees, suggests to me that this is genocide, not the total elimination of the Palestinians, but the total elimination of enough of them to get rid of the rest.
Okay, there are a few things I'd like to ask you about in response to that. The first is, you mentioned the phrase ethnic cleansing. Now, is that in legal terms different from a genocide?
It's not a legal term. It's a term which is commonly used to describe the removal of ethnically unwelcome groups from a territory.
Okay, but because it doesn't necessarily involve their killing, it is different to genocide.
Absolutely. It may be a war crime. It is not in itself genocide, as I said a while ago.
Okay. And the other challenge that has been put to me recently is that one of the key questions here when assessing genocide is something called commanding authority. So the commanding authority of the individuals who you have quoted. And so the argument is that Ben-Gvir and Smotrich do not have commanding authority over this war. They have political power, but not commanding authority. So can we take that question first before we move on to Netanyahu and Katz?
Of course, commanding authority is an important concept, and you've quite correctly described it. It is also true that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir are not themselves, they don't themselves have commanding authority, but they are members of a body, namely the Israeli cabinet, which does have command authority. And if you want to know what the Israeli cabinet intends to do, it is worth looking at the views, the publicly expressed views, of politicians without whom the Israeli cabinet would fall, because it is a reasonable inference, even without further statements by people like Netanyahu and Katz, who do have commanding authority. Even without those, it is very strong evidence as to what the position of the Israeli cabinet is. When you then turn to Katz, who has direct operational control as the Minister of Defense over what is going on, and Netanyahu is the Prime Minister of the government, it seems to me that the requirement of authority is satisfied. I think you need to bear in mind that a lot is expected of organized governments, more perhaps than is expected of terrorist organizations like Hamas. Israel is a democracy, at any rate, among citizens of Israel. It's a disputed category. Israel has highly disciplined and professional armed forces who comply with political orders. And therefore, it seems to me that one is entitled to assume that those things that are done in Gaza are being done by the authority of the government of Israel.
Okay, and so I think the logic of this is that the most damning quotes so far in terms of the case against Israel, the case that it is committing genocide, come from Netanyahu himself. But in particular, it seems to me, from your piece and from what you've said, Israel Katz, the defense minister.
Yes, but I think also the views of the extreme right members of the cabinet, bearing in mind their political strength, are also important.
Mm-hmm. And can we deal with the what Israel Katz is proposing here? And you've already mentioned it. This is the creation of what I think they call a sort of humanitarian city, or a on the ruins of Rafah. Now, when we judge that, I mean, and it does seem extraordinary, and I think it's Ehud Olmert, the former Israeli prime minister, has been incredibly critical of this plan and has said it amounts to ethnic cleansing himself, I think. Now, I struggle to find the defense for this plan. In what possible way can we read anything other than a war crime?
Well, I don't think there is a defense. I mean, the Fourth Geneva Convention is absolutely explicit in prohibiting the permanent displacement of part of the population of an occupied territory. About 2/3 of Gaza is currently directly occupied by the Israeli Defense Forces. Mm-hmm. And it is therefore an occupied territory without any doubt. And these statements indicate that what is planned is a mass displacement of the population. There is no defense.
Mm-hmm. How important, in your judgment, has it been to consider the so-called Trump plan in relation to this, which has been to it's unclear, I think, exactly what the Trump plan is, but it is essentially to recreate Gaza anew, and
without the Palestinian population.
Without the Palestinian population.
Yes.
Now, is that something that would play in legally into a case against Israel?
I don't think so. Historically, it may be true that this is what prompted the Israeli government to embark on the displacement plan. Mm-hmm. It may have persuaded them that they would be able, with the support of the United States, to get away with things that they couldn't have done without that support. But I don't think that adds or subtracts, for that matter, anything to the case of genocide. The responsibility in question is that of the Israeli government. It's their intention that matters. Exactly how they formed that intention doesn't matter. Particularly, what matters is what the intention was. Okay, and I'd like to now make a couple of sort of moral charges, I guess, in a way, or challenges. And you and I have talked about this over email, but I think it would be worth the listeners hearing as well. And this is something that's presented to me, and I've tried to think about how my own views are on this, and it has been very helpful to me to be able to talk this through with you. But the challenge is essentially this, that the moral responsibility for what is happening in Gaza lies fundamentally with Hamas for the actions that they took on October 7th and the refusal to return the hostages to the Israelis and to accept surrender. And if they were to have done so, if they had the Palestinians' best interests at heart and the future of Gaza, they would quite quickly have returned the hostages and surrendered. Had they done that, then what we are witnessing now would not have happened. That is the challenge. Yes. Well, my answer to that is that if you take war crimes first, it is completely irrelevant to the definition of a war crime whose fault it was that the hostilities started in the first place. International humanitarian law prescribes the way in which you are permitted to make war. And that applies just as much to people who are making a just war as to people who are making an unjust one. I do not deny for a moment that Hamas is guilty of very serious war crimes of its own, and its activities are indeed criminal in a broader sense, which is completely independent of their participation in any hostilities. But that is not an excuse for attacking the entire population of Palestine in the way that the Israeli government has done. After all, more than 9/10 of the population are homeless. Now, I've no doubt some of them are undoubtedly Hamas operatives, but collective retribution against an entire population of 2 million people in response to outrages, however terrible, such as those committed by Hamas, is simply not allowed. And the same is true of the charge of genocide. Eliminating a part of a population identified by its ethnic or national characteristics is genocidal. And it is not permitted, even in response to a gross threat like that of Hamas. I mean, Hamas is a terrorist organization. The word is commonly avoided, but I'm not afraid of using it. It seems to me to be accurate. But it is not the whole population of Gaza.
Mm. You, as well as being a judge, are also a historian of the 100 Years' War. Yes. I wonder how you are thinking about this war in relation to history rather than to law. Because in one sense, I worry that what we are seeing here may be the destruction of an order that was built relatively recently in historic terms. And this is more akin to the kind of war that has happened throughout human history. And so I suppose there's two parts to that question. One is how you see it historically in relation to what has gone in the past, but also, I suppose, how we are to think about what is coming in the future and what are the consequences for those of us who live outside of Israel and Gaza, and how wars will be fought in the future if this is allowed to continue in the fashion that is happening now, if, as you have laid out, war crimes continue and potentially even a genocide.
It is an unfortunate fact that the laws of war are quite frequently broken. They are being broken currently on a very regular basis by Russia in Ukraine, which has deliberately targeted civilians and civilian facilities. I cite that as only one example. There have undoubtedly been war crimes, although on a much smaller scale, in most of the wars that have been fought since the Second World War. Most of the wars that have been fought since the times when wars were entirely the affair of uniformed armies operating in defined space and time. That is a fact. Does it follow that we are witnessing the demise of international humanitarian law and the treaty law contained in the Geneva Conventions? No, I don't think it does follow. I think that the fact that a body of laws is persistently broken does not detract from their moral force. And I think that that most countries are strongly influenced by the desire to be seen to comply with these laws. It's very striking fact that the main principles of international humanitarian law are in fact contained in the military manuals of a very large number of countries, including Israel. Mm-hmm. And therefore they do have a certain moral authority. And although it's a tragedy that when they are broken, the fact is that they would be broken far more often if world opinion didn't take the view that these rules actually matter. And they do, because the current state of international humanitarian law is essentially born in the years after the Second World War by the horrific experiences of European and some Far Eastern populations in the course of that war. And I think that everybody would agree that we do not wish to go back to area bombing, to indiscriminate attacks on civilians, to the mass displacement of whole populations. These are barbarous things. And I think that the creation of a body of law governing the acts of governments fighting in hostilities is actually one of the great achievements of humanity in our time, by which I mean the time since the Second World War, and one which we should be proud of and which we should seek to conserve. I don't see the fact that it's broken as preventing that.
There are two thoughts I have listening to that. One is, in one sense, I wonder whether what we are seeing here is a consequence, in some senses, of the Trump presidency. In that, as you said, it was you observed or you questioned whether what the Israelis were doing at the moment would have been possible without the Trump plan, in quotes. And the fact that he is so open in his dismissal or disdain for international law is a necessary part of this story, in that it is contributing to the breakdown of Israel's willingness to abide by it. That's one observation. I think a more cynical observation would then come back and say, well, you talked about area bombardment and all the rest. I mean, this happened on a greater scale in Vietnam during this our era, with presidents who were more committed, in theory, to international law, and yet it happened.
Yes. I think, for example, the disafforestation of large parts of central Vietnam and Cambodia were plainly contrary to the Geneva Conventions. There were a number of other things that were, although the other things tended to happen at lower levels of command than the bombing of the napalming of large areas of forest. I think there is a sense in which Trump has encouraged this because, as you say, has complete contempt for international law, even in the case of treaties to which the United States is a party. Undoubtedly, I think the Israeli government has been encouraged by the fact that whereas past presidents would have objected and threatened to cut off diplomatic and military support to Israel, there is no likelihood that Trump is going to do that. Israel is heavily dependent on the United States. The United States can be relied upon to veto any anti-Israeli motions in the Security Council. The United States contributes approximately $3 billion a year to the Israeli defense budget, which is about 10% of that budget. The United States provides advanced weapon systems of a kind that it would not provide to many other countries. And indeed, it has recently, essentially at Israel's request, bombed the nuclear facilities of Israel's principal international enemy, Iran. So the United States matters a very great deal, and it follows that if the United States tolerates this kind of behavior, it's much easier to do.
Mm-hmm. I guess, again, there's a final question here. I'm torn between different ways of trying to think about this conflict, this war, these atrocities, between thinking of them as consequences of these larger forces that are playing out in the United States. Is Israel enabled or by the moves in power in Washington? Is it are atrocities the consequence of the scale of American power in our world, as we saw in Vietnam? Or do we think about this war on a much kind of more personal level, in moral terms, as a kind of tragic story in which you are kind of fated to, as a nation or as a people, to mirror the worst of your enemies? And what I mean by that is that when you observe this war and Hamas's determination is to destroy Israel, as it is made very clear that it does not see Israel as legitimate, it seeks to destroy it, will use any means it can to kill as many.
It has absolutely no prospect of achieving that.
No, but it has the ambition to kill as many Jews as possible. Does that in itself, in moral terms, think as a historian, does that change a people? Does that make a conflict like this inevitable in some sense?
I don't think it makes it inevitable. Obviously, it makes it more likely. And, one can well understand that the indiscriminate and adventitious nature of terrorist violence of the kind for which Hamas is responsible is going to provoke an extreme reaction, as indeed it has done. The tragedy of this is the story doesn't actually start with the 7th of October 2023, or even with Hamas. This is a conflict which in one form or another dates back to 1948 and indeed even earlier than that. It's a very bitter conflict. At one stage, not now, I think Israel is pretty invulnerable now, but it wasn't always so. And so one can see, just as a matter of human psychology and historical analysis, why this has happened. And I think we do have a duty to understand why it has happened. And that means understanding not only Israel's reaction to terrorist attacks by the likes of Hamas, but also understanding why it is that Hamas was elected as a government in Gaza by the Palestinian population, and why it is that there is some support among Palestinians for violent response to Israel. This is going to continue indefinitely until we find a way, or Israel finds a way, because it's very much in their hands, until Israel finds a way of accommodating the desires of the Palestinians, some of which are entirely legitimate. I mean, the Palestinians have been cleared out of territory which their ancestors occupied for 14 centuries. And that is a really serious and catastrophic thing to happen to people. You must expect them to react with violence, just as you expect Israel to react with violence to the kind of events that happened on the 7th of October 2023. I think that it's useless and destructive to approach these problems on the basis of asking, well, who is most to blame? Because there's a good deal of blame to be found on both sides. The object ought to be to resolve a problem which can only get worse if it's allowed to continue.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan Sumption, thank you very much for writing this week's cover story and for coming into the studio to talk to us today.